Today on the newscast, has the Iranian regime declared war against the United States in Iraq and Syria? 2 more attacks there today against U.S. forces. Get all the breaking details coming up. Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to the Watchman Newscast. It's one of the most important stories developing in the Middle East right now. The Iranian regime has basically declared war against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria with the goal of pushing every last U.S. soldier out of the Middle East. Over the past 24 hours alone, we've seen 3 attacks launched by Iranian-backed Shia militias against U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria. 3 attacks. Let's take it one by one. Today, the big one. 14 rockets launched by Iranian-backed Shia militias against Ain al-Assad airbase in western Iraq. Now, that's located in Anbar province. 14 rockets fell inside the base and around the perimeter, according to U.S. officials, and 3 people were wounded. Now, we're not sure yet if these were U.S. soldiers. We will have more details, I'm sure, as the day progresses. But this happened today, Wednesday, July 7th. Again, 14 rockets. Folks, that's quite a major barrage against a U.S. base and a quite bold move by the Iranian regime as it employs these proxies against the United States in Iraq and Syria. Speaking of Syria, most of the time here in the newscast over the past few months, when we've been telling you about this steady stream of attacks against U.S. assets, they have been in Iraq. We're also seeing now an uptick against U.S. forces in Syria. Remember, there are some 2,500 U.S. soldiers in Iraq right now, several hundred in Syria, mostly in eastern Syria. The goal in both cases is for U.S. personnel to aid in the fight against ISIS. But the real threat in the region now, not to minimize what ISIS is, but the real threat, the imminent threat, the growing threat is undoubtedly the Iranian regime. And folks, they are on the march. So we had the 14 rockets today in Iraq that I mentioned. Also in Syria, explosive-laden drones, again today, Wednesday, July 7th, targeting U.S. troops in Syria. Now, according to the U.S. and the Syrian Democratic Forces, who U.S. soldiers are working with in that country, they were able to neutralize these drones. They did not cause any damage, but we're still waiting for word again about those 3 injuries at Ain al-Assad Air Base in Iraq. The 3rd attack in the past 24 hours occurred yesterday, late yesterday, Tuesday, July 6th, Erbil International Airport. Now, that's in northern Iraq. Iraqi Kurdistan. Folks, I was in that airport just last year passing through as I spent 6 days filming in Iraqi Kurdistan. An incredible production trip for the Watchman TV show. We've also shared clips here on the newscast of my experience in Iraqi Kurdistan. U.S. soldiers are stationed right near Erbil International Airport in northern Iraq. And yesterday, explosive-laden drones slammed into the airport, caused a fire that was thankfully put out. Again, in that case, no one hurt or injured. But folks, obviously, there is an increase. When you have 3 major attacks in 24 hours, something is happening here, something is afoot, and it's not good. Now, folks, these 3 attacks are just the tip of the iceberg. We reported here yesterday on the newscast about further attacks in Iraq. We've really seen a surge since July 4th in particular. That is no surprise. Obviously, the Iranian regime and their proxies know that the 4th of July has great significance for the United States. But let's take it back to January 1st. Since the beginning of this year, we have seen at least 55 attacks against U.S. personnel in the region, mainly rockets for the first few months of this year. Now the Iranian regime and its proxies are increasingly shifting to drones, the hybrid model that they use in Saudi Arabia so effectively. More on that in a minute. Missiles, rockets in this case, and attack drones. The drone program is really something that the Iranian regime is proud of. They've been showing off their drone hardware over the past few months, and they are increasingly employing these attack drones on the battlefield more and more against U.S. forces in Iraq. So why is this happening? Why is the Iranian regime doing this? Why are they surging right now, really, against U.S. forces in Iraq and increasingly even in Syria. It's real simple, folks. The Iranian regime wants to push the United States out of the Middle East permanently, for good, and then the regime will be able to do what they want to do in the region without the United States there. Iran and its proxies feel that they can really run amok. Not only that, they will raise the banner of victory. They will boast to the world that they succeeded in pushing the great Satan out of the region. So this would be a great propaganda victory for the Iranian regime if it does indeed happen. They want to create a fall of Saigon type moment in Iraq and Syria with, in their view, the U.S. chased out of the region with its tail between its legs. That's the imagery that Iran wants to give off. That's why you're seeing the uptick in attacks. That's one reason. The other reason is the Iranian regime wants to create leverage at the negotiating table. Remember, the U.S. and Iran are once again negotiating indirectly in Vienna, Austria, about the U.S. re-entering that disastrous Iran nuclear deal. What Iran is doing right now with the consistent strikes against U.S. forces in Iraq, and again, this is essentially a declaration of war, folks, against the United States, a proxy war against the U.S., proxies employed by Iran with lethal effect in Iraq and Syria. Iran's coming to the negotiating table and they're saying, hey, if you give us what we want, America, we'll back off. We'll leave your troops alone, but you have to leave the region ultimately. We cannot accept you here, but for now, maybe we'll back off a bit with the rockets and the drones in Iraq and Syria if you give us what we want. And what does the Iranian regime want? They want every last sanction that President Trump rightly put in place dropped. And guess what? The Biden administration just might do it. Now remember, the Biden White House ordered airstrikes against those Iraqi Shia militias along the Iraq-Syria border last week. We had a similar airstrike back in February ordered by President Biden. But folks, this is just not enough, clearly, to deter the Iranian regime and those Shia militias. Since the airstrikes last week, the attacks against U.S. forces in Iraq have actually increased. So clearly, the Iranian regime is not getting the memo, and they don't take the Biden White House seriously when it comes to deterrence. Ultimately, the goal here is to do exactly what the Iranians are doing to the Saudis in Yemen. We've talked a lot here on the newscast about the Houthis, that other Iranian proxy operating in Yemen, where the Saudis are going toe-to-toe with the Houthi rebels, the Saudis, the UAE, and Arab coalition fighting against those Iran-backed rebels in Yemen. And what has Iran done? Really, for the past 2 years, it has used that hybrid model, rockets, missiles, drones, on practically a daily basis, folks. The Houthis are bombarding Saudi Arabia with rockets and drones. Now we have the Saudis suddenly meeting Saudi officials, meeting with Iranian officials about negotiating a possible end to the war in Yemen against the Houthis. So you could say that Iran has succeeded, in a sense, in bringing the Saudis to the table through the rockets and drones. That's exactly what they are trying to do to the United States in Iraq and Syria. Get a sweet deal for Iran at the negotiating table in Vienna when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal. So similar strategy in both countries. We see the blueprint in Yemen. Now it's being repeated in Iraq. Daily attacks on Saudi Arabia. Now daily attacks against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. Folks, we are keeping a very close eye on this. A breaking news element here for sure. One thing to keep in mind to encourage you. We talk a lot about the threat that the Iranian regime, not the Iranian people, but that the Iranian regime poses. Here's something to encourage you. The church is growing in Iran by leaps and bounds. Some 1 million Iranians have turned to Christ over the past few years. There's a thriving underground church. Despite relentless persecution against all odds, the gospel of Jesus Christ is spreading throughout Iran, the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism. It's really an amazing story. Only God could do this. This reminds me of the book of Acts, chapter 4, verse 20. What we have seen and heard. We cannot stop talking about what we have seen and what we have heard. Meaning, the gospel can't be stopped. Whether it's in Iran, China, North Korea, the gospel cannot be stopped. Remember that and be encouraged as we talk about all this nasty stuff going on in the world. Hey, you need to know, but remember, the gospel of the Lord Jesus cannot be stopped, and the Iranian regime is surely on notice. Hey, thanks so much for joining us here today on the Watchman Newscast. Until tomorrow, God bless you, and remember, never hold your peace. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman Newscast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, make sure you go ahead and hit the like button, click subscribe, and tap the bell icon to turn on notifications for new Watchman Newscast episodes every weekday.